The bright California sun was just beginning to climb over the horizon as Sarah Thompson's sleek black Mercedes S-Class pulled up to Riverside Executive Airport's private terminal. The morning air carried a crisp November chill, but Sarah, dressed in a perfectly tailored navy blue pantsuit, barely noticed it. At 42, she had built tech vision solutions from a startup in her garage to a $500 million company, and today's meeting in Chicago could push that value even higher. Sarah checked her Rolex, 6:45 a.m. She was early, just as she always liked to be. The pilot had already texted her that the jet was fueled and ready, the flight plan was filed, and the weather looked perfect for the 3-hour flight to Chicago. Everything was set for another smooth business trip, or so she thought. As her driver, Marcus, retrieved her overnight bag and leather briefcase from the trunk, Sarah took a moment to respond to a few urgent emails on her phone. The familiar routine of her travel preparations was interrupted by the sound of rushed footsteps approaching from behind. Mrs. Thompson called out Jenny Martinez, her personal assistant, who had arrived separately to deliver some last-minute documents. Jenny was breathing heavily, having rushed from her car with a folder clutched to her chest. "I'm so glad I caught you. The Baker contract needed your signature before the meeting." Sarah smiled warmly at the young woman who had proven invaluable over the past 2 years. "Thank you, Jenny. Always one step ahead, aren't you?" She took the folder and quickly reviewed the documents inside while standing next to her car. The private terminal was quietly bustling with early morning activity. A few other passengers were preparing for their own departures, and ground crew members moved efficiently about their tasks. Through the large glass windows, Sarah could see her chartered jet, a beautiful Gulfstream G650, being prepared for departure. As she signed the contract papers, Sarah noticed a new security guard watching her intently from near the terminal entrance. Something about his stare made her uncomfortable, but she brushed the feeling aside. In 15 years of frequent private air travel, she had learned to focus on her goals rather than others' reactions to her success. "All set," Sarah said, handing the folder back to Jenny. "Make sure legal gets these right away, and keep me updated on any responses from Baker's team while I'm in the air." "Of course, Mrs. Thompson. Have a safe flight," Jenny replied, already typing on her tablet as she walked back to her car. Sarah gathered her things and began walking toward the terminal entrance. Marcus followed with her luggage, his familiar presence reassuring after 5 years as her driver. The morning sun caught the diamond studs in her ears, gifts she bought herself after closing her first major deal. Through the terminal's windows, she could see the ground crew finishing their preparations. Her pilot, Captain Rodriguez, was doing his external walk-around inspection of the aircraft. The sight of the sleek private jet still gave her a small thrill, even after all these years. It represented everything she had worked for: the long nights, the risks taken, the barriers broken. As she approached the terminal door, Sarah pulled out her phone to check one last email before boarding. The message was from her daughter Ashley, a sophomore at Stanford. "Knock 'em dead in Chicago, Mom. Love you." Sarah smiled, remembering how far they'd come from the days when she was a single mother working 2 jobs to make ends meet. The terminal's automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh. The interior was climate-controlled and quietly elegant, with comfortable leather seating and subtle lighting. A few other early morning travelers looked up briefly from their phones and laptops before returning to their work. The smell of fresh coffee wafted from the executive lounge. Sarah approached the security checkpoint, her credentials and boarding documents ready in hand. She had done this hundreds of times before, and her paperwork was always meticulously in order. But something felt different this morning. The security guard she had noticed earlier was now standing at the checkpoint, and his expression had hardened as she got closer. Little did Sarah know that in the next few minutes, a routine business trip would turn into something entirely different. A confrontation that would not only test her composure, but would also shine a spotlight on issues that still plagued private aviation in 2024. Marcus set her bags down beside her, ready to head back to the car. The security guard's eyes narrowed as Sarah stepped forward, and in that moment, the energy in the terminal shifted palpably. The stage was set for what would become a morning that none of them would soon forget. The security guard, James Miller, stepped forward with an exaggerated show of authority. His name badge gleamed under the terminal lights as he held up his hand to stop Sarah, despite her having already placed her credentials on the security desk. his lips curled into what could barely pass as a professional smile. "I'm going to need to see some additional identification," Miller announced loudly, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. His voice carried an edge that made several heads turn. Sarah noticed how he had waved through 3 other passengers just moments before, all of them white, with barely a glance at their papers. "Of course," Sarah replied calmly, though she felt her heart rate quicken. She had already provided her pilot-verified credentials, TSA clearance, and government-issued ID. Drawing out her wallet again, she placed her driver's license next to her other documents. "Is there something specific you need to verify?" Miller picked up her ID with deliberate slowness, holding it up to the light as if examining a counterfeit bill. Behind him, Captain Rodriguez had entered the terminal and was walking toward the security checkpoint, having completed his external inspection of the aircraft. "This says you're the CEO of TechVision Solutions," Miller said, his tone dripping with skepticism. He looked Sarah up and down, taking in her expensive suit and designer briefcase with obvious disbelief. "And this is your private flight?" Sarah maintained her composure, years of dealing with prejudice in the tech industry having taught her patience. "Yes, that's correct. As you can see, Captain Rodriguez right there is my pilot, and all my paperwork is in order." Captain Rodriguez stepped forward, his 20 years of experience evident in his professional demeanor. "Mr. Miller, Mrs. Thompson is a regular client. I can personally verify her identity. We have a flight plan filed and are scheduled for departure in 15 minutes. Miller ignored the pilot completely, his attention fixed solely on Sarah. "I'm going to need to see your company documentation, proof that you're really the CEO, and maybe call your office to verify." He emphasized the word "your" in a way that made his meaning clear to everyone within earshot. By now, other passengers had stopped pretending not to watch. An elderly couple whispered to each other, shaking their heads in disapproval at Miller's behavior. A young businessman had taken out his phone and was quietly recording the interaction. Sarah reached into her briefcase and pulled out a folder containing her company documents, though she knew she wasn't required to provide them. "Mr. Miller, I've been flying from this terminal for 5 years. I'm happy to provide any reasonable documentation, but I'm curious why today's procedure seems different from my previous flights." Miller's face reddened slightly. "Just doing my job, ma'am. We have to be thorough with security these days, you understand." He flipped through her company documents without really reading them, then pushed them aside. "I'm still going to need to make some calls to verify all this." Sarah checked her watch. The deliberately slow inspection was eating into her schedule. She had a crucial meeting in Chicago that could make or break a major deal for her company. That's when she made a decision. Keeping her voice steady and professional, she pulled out her phone. "While you make your calls, I'll make one of my own. My attorney's office is just 10 minutes from here." She began recording the interaction as she dialed, noting how Miller's expression flickered with uncertainty for the first time. "You don't need to involve any lawyers," Miller said quickly, but his previously authoritative tone wavered. "This is a simple security verification." "I agree it should be simple," Sarah replied, phone to her ear. "Which is why I'm curious about why I'm being asked to provide documentation that wasn't required from any other passengers this morning." The terminal had grown quiet except for the soft background music playing through the speakers. Captain Rodriguez had stepped closer to Sarah, his presence supportive but professional. Even the cleaning staff had paused their work to watch the scene unfold. As Sarah waited for her attorney to answer, she could hear Miller shuffling papers nervously. The morning sun now streamed fully through the terminal windows, illuminating the scene in harsh clarity. What happened next would transform a simple act of discrimination into a moment of accountability that would resonate far beyond the walls of Riverside Executive Airport. Michael Chen answered Sarah's call on the second ring. The experienced civil rights attorney had just finished his morning coffee at a nearby cafe where he'd been reviewing case files. Sarah's voice was steady as she explained the situation, but Michael could detect the tension underneath her professional tone. "I'm 10 minutes away," Michael said without hesitation. "Keep recording everything. I'm on my way." He quickly packed his laptop into his briefcase, left a generous tip on the cafe table, and was in his car within 30 seconds. Back at the terminal, Sarah kept her phone recording as Miller continued to examine her documents. The security guard's confidence had noticeably diminished since she'd mentioned her lawyer, but he seemed determined to maintain his position of authority. "Ma'am, involving lawyers will only complicate things," Miller said, shuffling through her papers for the third time. "This is standard security protocol." Even as he spoke these words, another passenger, a white man in a golf shirt, walked through the checkpoint with just a quick flash of his ID. Sarah remained standing tall, her years of boardroom experience evident in her pose. "Mr. Miller, I'm happy to wait for my attorney. In the meantime, could you please explain why other passengers aren't being asked for company documentation or office verification?" The question hung in the air like heavy smoke. Miller's face flushed red, and he began to stammer about random selection and heightened security measures. Captain Rodriguez, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward again. "Sir," the pilot said firmly, "I've been flying Mrs. Thompson for 3 years. She's gone through this terminal dozens of times. This is the first time she's ever been subjected to this level of scrutiny." Other passengers had abandoned any pretense of not watching. The young businessman who had been recording the incident was now openly live-streaming it. An older woman in an expensive suit approached Sarah and handed her a business card. "I'm Patricia Reynolds, on the airport's board of directors," she whispered. "Please know this isn't how we operate. I'm calling the terminal manager right now." The next 7 minutes passed in tense silence. Miller had stopped talking but refused to return Sarah's documents or allow her through. He kept glancing at the terminal entrance, perhaps hoping Sarah's lawyer was bluffing about being so close. He wasn't. At exactly 7:12 a.m., Michael Chen walked through the terminal doors. At 45, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had fought and won similar battles many times before. His perfectly pressed charcoal suit and red tie projected an image of authority that made Miller visibly nervous. Following behind Michael was his assistant, Maria Torres, already taking notes on her tablet. She had worked with Michael long enough to know exactly what details would be important for their records. "Good morning," Michael said pleasantly, extending his hand to Sarah first, then to Miller. The security guard hesitated before accepting the handshake. "I'm Michael Chen, Mrs. Thompson's attorney. I understand there's some question about her documentation." Miller shifted his weight uncomfortably. "Just following security protocols, sir." Michael nodded thoughtfully. "I see. And these protocols, they require company documentation and office verification for all private jet passengers, or just some of them." He gestured toward the other travelers who had passed through easily during their conversation. The terminal manager, alerted by Patricia Reynolds, was now hurrying toward them. She was a middle-aged woman named Barbara Harris, and the look on her face suggested she understood exactly how serious the situation had become. "Mrs. Thompson's flight is now delayed by—" Michael checked his watch. 23 minutes. Given that she has a crucial business meeting in Chicago, any economic losses resulting from this delay would, of course, be factored into our response to this situation. The color drained from Miller's face as Michael continued in his calm, measured tone. Sarah stood beside her attorney, her dignity intact but her mind already calculating how this morning's events could lead to meaningful change. She had faced discrimination before, but this time was different. This time, she had the power and support to ensure it didn't happen to anyone else. The stage was set for what would become a pivotal moment in the airport's history, and everyone in the terminal could feel it. The next few minutes would determine not just whether Sarah made her flight, but whether real change would come to Riverside Executive Airport. Barbara Harris, the terminal manager, quickly took control of the situation. Her 20 years of airport management experience told her this was a powder keg that needed immediate diffusing. She glanced at the growing crowd of onlookers, the still recording phones, and Sarah's perfectly valid documentation spread across the security desk. "Mrs. Thompson, please accept my sincere apologies for this delay," Barbara said, her voice carrying the weight of authority. "Mr. Miller, please return Mrs. Thompson's documents immediately." Her tone left no room for argument. Miller's hands trembled slightly as he gathered Sarah's papers. Michael Chen watched carefully as each document was returned, while his assistant Maria continued taking detailed notes on her tablet. The young businessman who had been live-streaming the incident finally lowered his phone, but not before capturing Miller's uncomfortable compliance. "Mrs. Thompson has been cleared for her flight," Barbara announced firmly, but Michael Chen raised his hand politely. Before Mrs. Thompson proceeds to her aircraft, he said, pulling out a small leather notebook, I believe we need to address a few points. First, I'd like to review the airport's official security protocols. He turned to Miller. Could you please explain, for the record, exactly which regulation required additional company documentation for a pre-cleared private jet passenger? Miller's face went from red to pale. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, looking desperately at Barbara for help. The terminal manager's expression remained professionally neutral, but her eyes showed she had already reached some conclusions about Miller's future employment. I was just being thorough, Miller managed to say. Thorough? Michael repeated thoughtfully. In the 23 minutes we've been standing here, I've observed 12 other passengers pass through this checkpoint. None were asked for company documentation. None had their offices called for verification. He paused, letting the implication sink in. Would you care to explain the criteria you used to select Mrs. Thompson for this extra thoroughness? The terminal had grown so quiet that the soft hum of the air conditioning seemed loud. Patricia Reynolds, a board member, had pulled out her own phone and was rapidly typing what looked like an email to her fellow board members. Captain Rodriguez stepped forward again. If I may, he said, addressing Barbara directly, I can confirm that Mrs. Thompson has flown through this terminal 47 times in the past 3 years. This is the first time she's encountered such thoroughness. Barbara nodded, her decision made. Mr. Miller, please report to my office immediately after your shift. She turned to Sarah and Michael. I assure you both that appropriate action will be taken. But right now, Mrs. Thompson has an important meeting to attend. Michael consulted quietly with Sarah for a moment before responding. We appreciate your prompt attention to this matter, he said. However, we'll need written confirmation that a full investigation will be conducted, along with a review of all security protocols and staff training procedures. Barbara didn't hesitate. Of course, I'll have that to you by end of business today. She glanced at Miller, who seemed to be shrinking into himself. We take these matters very seriously. Sarah checked her watch. Despite the delay, she could still make her meeting if they left immediately. She looked at Michael and nodded slightly. They had worked together long enough that he understood her silent communication. Mrs. Thompson will proceed to her flight now, Michael announced. We'll be in touch regarding the formal complaint and subsequent actions. He handed Barbara his business card, then turned to Miller. Mr. Miller, I suggest you review the Civil Rights Act of 1964 before our next interaction. Barbara personally escorted Sarah toward the terminal doors leading to the tarmac, where her Gulfstream waited. Captain Rodriguez hurried ahead to ensure the jet was ready for immediate departure. As they walked, Barbara was already outlining the changes she would implement, including mandatory bias training and a complete overhaul of security procedures. Behind them, Miller stood frozen at his post, watching as his actions of the past half hour unraveled what had been a steady job of 8 years. The other passengers began to move again, some shaking their heads, others openly discussing what they had witnessed. As Sarah stepped out onto the tarmac, the morning sun still bright and promising, she felt a mixture of emotions. Frustration at the familiar discrimination, satisfaction at having stood her ground, and hope that her experience might prevent similar incidents in the future. Sometimes, she reflected, change needed a catalyst. Today, she had provided one. As Sarah's jet lifted into the clear California sky, Barbara Harris marched back into the terminal with purpose in every step. The morning's events had shaken the usually calm terminal manager, but they had also strengthened her resolve. 20 years of airport management experience had taught her that crisis moments demanded immediate action. Mr. Miller, in my office. Now. Her voice carried across the terminal floor, leaving no room for discussion. The security guard's shoulders slumped as he followed her, leaving his post to be covered by another guard who had been quickly called in. Patricia Reynolds, the board member who had witnessed everything, was already seated in Barbara's office when they arrived. Her laptop was open, and the grave expression on her face suggested she had been busy. On the screen was an email chain with other board members, all responding with urgent concern to her initial report. Sit down, Mr. Miller, Barbara said, closing her office door. The glass walls of her office were frosted for privacy, but the shapes of curious onlookers could still be seen gathering outside. The morning's incident had spread through the terminal like wildfire. I can explain, Miller began, but Patricia held up her hand. Before you continue, she said, turning her laptop around, I want you to watch something. On the screen was the security footage from the past hour, showing multiple angles of Miller's interaction with Sarah and other passengers. The contrast in his treatment of different travelers was startlingly clear in the recorded footage. Barbara leaned forward at her desk. In the past 30 minutes, I've received calls from 2 board members, an FAA representative, and a major news network. She paused, letting that sink in. The young man who was live streaming has over 50,000 followers. His video is already going viral. Miller's face went pale as he watched himself on the security footage. The camera angles captured everything: his dismissive attitude toward Captain Rodriguez, his obvious different treatment of other passengers, and his clear discomfort when confronted by Michael Chen. I didn't mean, Miller stammered, but the words died in his throat as the evidence played before him. Patricia closed her laptop firmly. Mr. Miller, I've been on this airport's board for 15 years. We've worked hard to build a reputation for excellence and fairness. What happened this morning isn't just morally wrong, it's legally indefensible and commercially disastrous. Barbara pulled out a thick employee handbook from her desk drawer. Section 7.3 clearly outlines our non-discrimination policies. Section 12.1 details the proper security screening procedures. She opened to the marked pages. Can you point out which of these protocols you were following this morning? Miller's silence was deafening. Outside the office, the terminal was buzzing with activity. The story had spread to the private pilot lounges, where veteran pilots were sharing their own experiences with Sarah Thompson, her professionalism, her regular flights, her contributions to various aviation charities. Barbara's phone buzzed again, another email from Michael Chen, this one containing a formal request for all security footage and a detailed list of documents relating to the airport's training procedures and past incidents. Mr. Miller, Barbara said finally, your employment with Riverside Executive Airport is terminated, effective immediately. Please surrender your security badge and clear out your locker. Human Resources will contact you regarding final paperwork. Miller's face crumpled. But I've worked here for 8 years. 8 years during which, Patricia interjected, we have to wonder how many other passengers faced similar treatment that wasn't caught on camera or didn't have immediate legal representation available. As Miller was escorted out by security, an ironic twist that wasn't lost on the watching terminal staff, Barbara turned to Patricia. We need to do more than just fire one person. This needs to be a moment of real change. Patricia was already typing on her laptop. I'm calling an emergency board meeting for this afternoon. We need a complete overhaul of our training programs, security protocols, and accountability measures. She looked up at Barbara. And we need to make sure Mrs. Thompson knows we're taking this seriously. Barbara nodded, turning to look out her office window at the clear sky where Sarah's jet had disappeared just minutes ago. The morning's events had revealed cracks in their system that needed fixing, and she was determined to ensure that no other passenger would ever face such discrimination at her terminal again. The real work was just beginning. High above the clouds, Sarah sat in her leather seat aboard the Gulfstream, her laptop open but her mind still processing the morning's events. Captain Rodriguez had made up some time in the air, and they were now expected to arrive in Chicago with just enough time for her meeting. Her phone buzzed with an incoming email from Barbara Harris. The terminal manager's message was comprehensive and direct. It detailed Miller's immediate termination, the emergency board meeting scheduled for that afternoon, and the sweeping changes already being put into motion. Attached was a formal letter of apology and a document outlining the airport's commitment to implementing new security protocols and staff training programs. As Sarah read through the email, another message popped up, this one from the young businessman who had recorded the incident. His video had already gathered over 100,000 views, and major news networks were reaching out for permission to use the footage. He wanted Sarah to know that he stood with her and offered to share any documentation she might need. Mrs. Thompson, Captain Rodriguez called from the cockpit doorway. We're making good time. We should land about 10 minutes before your meeting. He paused, then added, I've filed a formal pilot's report about this morning's incident. Every pilot who's ever flown you has signed it already. Sarah smiled gratefully. Thank you, Captain. She looked out the window at the landscape passing below. In the reflection of the glass, She could see herself, poised, successful, unstoppable. Yet this morning had reminded her that no amount of success could completely shield someone from prejudice. Her phone rang. It was Michael Chen. The airport board just sent over their preliminary action plan, he said without preamble. They're not just doing damage control, Sarah. They're making real changes. He began listing the initiatives: mandatory monthly bias training for all staff, new security protocols requiring documented reasons for any additional screening, quarterly audits of all security interactions, and the creation of a passenger advocacy office. They're also requesting your input, Michael continued. They want to establish a diversity advisory committee and hope you'll consider taking a leadership role. Sarah thought about all the other travelers who might face similar discrimination, those without lawyers on speed dial or the confidence that comes with running a successful company. Her position gave her the power to push for meaningful change. Tell them I'm interested, she replied, but I want to review their complete proposal first. As they neared Chicago, Sarah received another email, this one from Patricia Reynolds. The board member had attached the minutes from their emergency meeting, showing unanimous support for all proposed changes. They had also voted to allocate substantial funding for new training programs and security system upgrades. 10 minutes to landing, Mrs. Thompson, Captain Rodriguez announced over the intercom. Sarah began gathering her materials for the upcoming meeting, but her mind was already working on something bigger. She opened a new email and began typing a message to her company's board of directors. Perhaps TechVision Solutions could develop security screening software that would help eliminate bias in airports across the country. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a text from her daughter Ashley. Mom, I just saw the video. You handled that like a boss. Love you and so proud of you. As the plane descended toward Chicago, Sarah felt a sense of purpose that went beyond her business meeting. Sometimes leadership meant taking a stand not just for yourself, but for everyone who might come after you. The morning's confrontation had been uncomfortable, but it had sparked changes that could benefit countless future travelers. The landing gear engaged with a gentle thud, and Sarah could see the Chicago skyline through her window. In just under an hour, she would be presenting to potential investors about TechVision's latest innovations. But now she had another project in mind, one that could help ensure that what happened this morning wouldn't happen to anyone else. Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom one final time. Welcome to Chicago, Mrs. Thompson, and if I may say, it's been an honor to be your pilot today. The plane touched down smoothly, and Sarah knew that while one journey was ending, another was just beginning. Sometimes the most important changes came from the most unexpected moments, and she was ready to make the most of this one. 1 week after the incident at Riverside Executive Airport, Sarah sat in her San Francisco office reviewing the latest developments. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the stack of papers on her desk, reports, proposals, and letters that had emerged from that fateful morning. The video of her confrontation with Miller had garnered over 2 million views. Major news networks had picked up the story, turning what could have been just another instance of discrimination into a national conversation about bias in private aviation. Sarah's inbox was filled with messages from other executives of color sharing similar experiences. Mrs. Thompson, her assistant Jenny called through the intercom. Michael Chen is here for the meeting with the airport board representatives. Sarah straightened her desk and stood to greet her visitors. Barbara Harris and Patricia Reynolds entered, followed by Michael and 2 other airport board members. The change in Barbara was visible. She carried herself with renewed purpose, the weight of implementing major reforms evident in her determined expression. The new training programs are already showing results, Barbara began, opening a thick binder of reports. We've completely restructured our security protocols, and every staff member has gone through intensive bias awareness training. Patricia added, we've also installed new security cameras with audio recording capabilities, and every screening interaction is now logged and reviewed daily. She pulled up statistics on her tablet. In just 1 week, we've seen a 40% decrease in additional screening requests, with no compromise to security effectiveness. Michael nodded approvingly as he reviewed the numbers. And the staff feedback? Initially resistant, Barbara admitted, but after we showed them the data on unconscious bias in aviation security, most have embraced the changes. Those who couldn't adapt have been replaced. Sarah listened as they detailed other changes: a new anonymous reporting system for passengers, regular audits by external civil rights consultants, and partnerships with other private airports to share best practices. The incident had triggered a ripple effect across the private aviation industry. "But there's something else we wanted to discuss," Patricia said, turning to Sarah. "We've been approached by several other airports wanting to implement similar changes. They're asking for guidance, and frankly, we think you should be part of that conversation." Sarah's mind went to the project she'd been developing over the past week. She opened her laptop and turned it toward the group. "Actually, I've been working on something that might help." On the screen was a prototype for new security screening software developed by TechVision Solutions. "Our engineers have created an AI-based system that helps eliminate bias from security protocols," Sarah explained. "It standardizes screening procedures while flagging any patterns of discriminatory behavior." The group leaned forward, intrigued. Barbara's eyes lit up. "This could revolutionize how we handle security across the entire industry." As they discussed the potential implementation, Sarah's phone buzzed. It was a message from the young businessman who had recorded the incident. His social media advocacy had helped keep the story alive, and now other business travelers were sharing their own experiences with discrimination in private aviation. "The feedback from other airports has been overwhelming," Patricia shared. "They're realizing this isn't just about avoiding bad publicity. It's about creating real, lasting change in the industry." Michael pulled out some papers from his briefcase. "And speaking of change, the Civil Rights Commission wants to use this case as a model for other transportation hubs. They're particularly interested in your software solutions, Sarah." The meeting continued for another hour, with plans made and partnerships formed. As the group prepared to leave, Barbara handed Sarah one final document: the airport's new passenger Bill of Rights, with Sarah's input incorporated throughout. "We're not just fixing what went wrong that morning," Barbara said firmly. "We're building something better for everyone who comes after." After the visitors left, Sarah stood at her office window, looking out over the city. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from her daughter Ashley. "Just saw the news about the airport changes. You didn't just stand up for yourself, Mom. You're changing things for everyone. You're my hero." Sarah smiled, thinking about how one difficult morning had sparked a movement for change. Sometimes the worst moments led to the best opportunities for transformation. Her calendar was now filled with speaking engagements, consulting requests, and meetings with aviation industry leaders, all focused on creating a more equitable future in private aviation. The incident with Miller had been painful, but its impact would help ensure that future travelers would face fewer such barriers. Sometimes, Sarah reflected, leadership meant turning obstacles into opportunities for systemic change. 6 months after the incident at Riverside Executive Airport, Sarah Thompson stood at a podium in the airport's newly renovated terminal. Behind her, a large screen displayed the logo of the newly established Aviation Equality Initiative, a program that had grown from that challenging morning into a nationwide movement for change. The terminal was packed with journalists, aviation industry leaders, and government officials. In the front row sat Barbara Harris and Patricia Reynolds, both now recognized as pioneers in aviation security reform. Michael Chen sat nearby, a proud smile on his face as he watched his client become an agent of industry-wide transformation. 6 months ago, I stood in this terminal facing discrimination," Sarah began, her voice clear and confident. "Today, I stand here celebrating change." She gestured to the screen, which switched to show statistics from the TechVision Solutions security software now implemented at 23 private airports across the country. The numbers told a compelling story: bias incidents down by 78%, passenger satisfaction up by 45%, and security efficiency improved by 33%. The software, developed by Sarah's company and refined through real-world feedback, had exceeded all expectations. Captain Rodriguez, who still flew Sarah regularly, stood at the back of the crowd. He had become a vocal advocate for change within the pilot community, leading workshops on recognizing and addressing discrimination in aviation. His pilot's report from that morning had become a case study in aviation training programs nationwide. "But numbers only tell part of the story," Sarah continued. She nodded to a group of people standing to her left, 15 individuals from various backgrounds, all successful professionals who had faced similar experiences. Today, I'm proud to announce that the Aviation Equality Initiative is expanding. With support from major airlines and private aviation companies, we're implementing these changes at another 50 airports by year's end. Barbara stepped forward to share how Riverside had become a model for other airports. The security protocols developed in response to Sarah's experience have been refined and standardized, creating a template that other facilities could easily adopt. The anonymous reporting system had helped identify and address numerous instances of bias before they escalated. What happened here 6 months ago was wrong, Barbara acknowledged. But it sparked a transformation that has made private aviation more accessible and equitable for everyone. She turned to face Sarah, and we owe much of that to Mrs. Thompson's courage and leadership. As if on cue, Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket. She knew without looking that it was Ashley, who had become deeply involved in the initiative while completing her studies at Stanford. Her daughter had helped create a youth advisory board, ensuring that the next generation's perspectives were included in the ongoing reforms. Patricia Reynolds took the podium next, announcing the creation of a scholarship program for minority students interested in aviation careers. The program, funded by a consortium of private aviation companies, would help create a more diverse pipeline of talent for the industry. Change doesn't happen in isolation, Patricia declared. It happens when we turn moments of challenge into opportunities for growth. The young businessman who had recorded the original incident was also present, his social media advocacy having evolved into a full-time role as the initiative's communications director. His original video, which had now been viewed over 10 million times, played silently on a loop in the terminal's museum exhibit chronicling the movement's history. As the ceremony concluded, Sarah found herself surrounded by people sharing their stories and expressing gratitude. But her mind wandered to James Miller, the former security guard. She had learned that after his termination, he had undergone extensive bias training and now worked with a civil rights organization, sharing his story as a cautionary tale and an example of the possibility of personal transformation. Outside the terminal windows, private jets took off and landed against the California sky. Each one carried passengers who would benefit from the changes implemented over the past 6 months. Changes that ensured everyone, regardless of their appearance, would be treated with dignity and respect. Sarah's phone buzzed again. This time it was Michael Chen with news that 5 more airports had signed on to implement the initiative's programs. She smiled, knowing that what had started as one woman's stand against discrimination had grown into a movement that was reshaping an entire industry. As she watched another plane take off, Sarah reflected on how sometimes the biggest changes come from the smallest moments of courage. That morning 6 months ago had been difficult, but it had led to something powerful and lasting, a transformation that would benefit generations of travelers to come. The story that began with one guard's bias had ended with an industry's awakening, proving that positive change was possible when people stood up for what was right.